Electric vehicles are taking charge around the world. Sales are ramping up, but how good are they really for the environment? I'm Anand Naidu, and we'll take you on a ride on the heat. They've become a common sight in many cities around the United States, increasingly filling the streets and in some instances leaving the competition in the dust. In the first quarter of 2022, the Tesla Model 3 and Model Y outsold all other cars in the state of California. There were roughly 21,000 new registrations of each model in the state during the first 3 months of this year. In a distant third place was the Toyota RAV4 with close to 16,000 new registrations. Rising prices and long waits for deliveries have not put the brakes on demand for these cars. In fact, last year, sales of these vehicles doubled in the United States. And that number could have been higher if automakers had been able to build cars faster. Companies struggled with shortages of semiconductors, and electric cars require even more of these electronic chips than gasoline vehicles, while prices soared for lithium and other raw materials needed for batteries. And the sector can expect a turbocharge in demand. The United States Congress is expected to approve a tax credit that will make these vehicles cheaper for the next 10 years. In the United States, Tesla is leading the pack. But while sales of EVs are speeding up here, they are still laps behind Europe and China. In Europe, 1 in every 10 cars sold is electric, and in China, it's 1 out of every 5. In fact, Chinese company BYD has taken over Tesla as the global leader in clean energy car sales, which includes electric and hybrid vehicles. BYD sold more than 640,000 clean energy vehicles in the first half of this year. Tesla delivered close to 565,000. Not bad for a company that was laughed at by Tesla's CEO Elon Musk some years back during an interview with Bloomberg.
Although there's competitors now ramping up, and as you're familiar with BYD, which is also on the West Coast, I think they're ramping up production of their electric vehicles. Warren Buffett owns 10% stake in that. Why do you laugh? BYD is trying to compete. Why do you laugh?
Have you seen their car?
I have seen their cars, yes. In fact, at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, I saw their cars.
Yeah.
Well, they're on a different, tell me why you're laughing. You don't see them at all as a competitor?
No.
Why is that? I mean, they offer a lower price point.
I don't think they have a great product.
Well, Musk may have changed his mind by now. Not only is BYD selling more cars than Tesla, but there are reports that the American company will start buying batteries from BYD for its cars. The Chinese automaker is setting its sights on the international market and might soon be seen in the world's second largest market, the United States. Today we'll be discussing the electric vehicle market, where it's going, and how competition can drive prices down. We'll also be looking at the environmental issue. Are electric vehicles really green? Despite not burning fossil fuels to spin the wheels, in many countries the main source of electricity is coal. Critics say that EVs just change the emissions from the tailpipe to the thermal plant chimneys. And with more electric cars on the road, can the grid sustain that much need for power? Welcome to our studio to talk about the electric vehicles market. Let's bring in our first 2 panelists. From Beijing, Tu Li is Managing Director of Sino Auto Insights, and Tyson Jominy is Vice President of Data Analytics at JD Power. He joins us from Nashville. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Tu Li, let me start with you, and let's talk about the EV, electric vehicle market in China. The Chinese automaker, BYD, that's based in Shenzhen, it's been seeing some phenomenal growth. In fact, in the first 6 months of this year, sales grew more than 300% compared to the same period last year. To what do you attribute this growth?
Well, I attribute it to BYD just being very patient and being vertically integrated and having products that resonate in the market. in China at the beginning of this year, there were supply chain issues with the automotive sector, and then COVID took over, which basically zeroed out April, parts of May. But we're seeing a huge increase in demand. The central government has put in some incentives in place, and we're looking at potentially a 6 million unit market by the end of 2022. So BYD is going to be leading that along with Tesla probably.
So when you say that BYD is very receptive to the market, Lee, give us an idea of what that means. I mean, how are they fulfilling what the market wants?
Yeah, so they have affordable vehicles across a lot of different segments, more on the mass market side, whether it's small crossover SUVs, whether it's sedans or hatchbacks. They kind of have a flavor for every segment. And then number two, due to the challenges in supply chain and COVID earlier this year, they were able to still produce vehicles. And so I think that's a huge advantage for them, primarily because they build their own chips or they fab their own chips and they build their own batteries. So whereas other OEMs here in China are chasing parts, they're actually in control of their own destiny. And so BYD, starting in August, is supposed to get up to 300,000 units of production per month. And so we're looking at an annual run rate of 3.6 million units. So they're going to be firing on all cylinders. They're not firing on all cylinders just yet, but they will be very soon.
Tyson, here in the United States, I mean, we're still waiting for the big takeoff as far as electric vehicles are concerned. I mean, China and Europe are far ahead of the United States when it comes to the adoption of electric vehicles. What's the holdup here? What are the major obstacles in the way of this really taking off?
Well, thanks for having me back on the show. I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, in China, new energy vehicles are running about 27% of the industry. In the US, it's running 7% of the industry. So quite a big difference. But in the US, the one place where we sort of see that same level of penetration is in the premium space. We actually see 25% of premium sales are currently new energy vehicle, and that's growing. And about 90% of that is electric, and 90% of that is Tesla, of course. So in the US, what we're seeing is very much a top-down approach coming in from a very high price point. The average electric vehicle transaction price is $66,000 in the US, compared to an industry average of $46,000 in the US. So what's holding it up? Low-priced EVs that normal consumers right in the middle of the market can buy.
So the premium market seeing some kind of a breakthrough, Tyson, but do you see prices come down in the near future?
Well, in the near future, they look like they're only going up, mostly due to supply issues and supply chain crisis that the industry is experiencing. Over the long term, though, we will expect prices to moderate and for EVs to get a lot more aggressive in their pricing. You know, this year we saw GM take a drastic price cut on the Chevy Bolt that now starts at $26,000. And in a market that averages 46, that's a very low-priced vehicle. So we do see that over time they will come down, but in the near term, a lot of pricing for consumers to accept.
Lee, one of the major shortcomings, of course, of electric cars is charging. It still takes a long time, relatively speaking, and range is still limited, as we can see. I mean, what do you make of the infrastructure here in the United States to accommodate increasing numbers of people using electric vehicles?
Well, I think there's two things going on with the infrastructure. First of all, there's just not enough. I think with some of the Biden administration's moves on policy changes and investment, I think that's going to change probably within the next 24, 30 months. But also creating a better user experience, because I think there's some statistics about the U.S. where a person that purchases an EV goes back to an ICE vehicle 60% of the time or something like that. And so a part of that is probably having a bad experience charging. And so here in China, we still have challenges, but we don't think about range. You know, the Chinese consumer doesn't concern themselves that much with range anxiety, because I think the infrastructure is robust and there are enough electric vehicles around to make people much more comfortable as well. So I think with the United States, they could look at what's going on in China and maybe use that as a template. The other thing is having, Tesla, why they are at, 80% market share on the premium electric vehicle is because they have the one-to-one supercharging network, right? And so that creates a huge advantage for them, at least initially in the United States. It'll go away as more charging infrastructure is created one-to-many in the United States, but that's going to take some time, I think.
Tyson, of course, big brands are promising to go electric, fully electric. In fact, if you look at a company like Jaguar, they're saying that all their cars that they manufacture will be fully electric by 2025. That's only 3 years away. I mean, is that feasible? What kind of stress is that going to put on the current infrastructure?
Well, certainly, we've seen a lot of big promises, and undoubtedly not all of them will be met. But for some of the luxury brands, it's going to be a necessity pretty quickly to fully transition, and most of them have those kind of plans. Whereas you talk about the big mainstream manufacturers, Ford and Chevy, that are doing a great job with transitioning to EVs, yet their portfolios are so broad that it will take a lot longer to convert. So the smaller you are, the quicker you could convert over, and a lot of the high-end consumers are far more accepting of the technology because they are tech customers first, and they really enjoy sort of the tech features. That's what we've seen with the Tesla buyer. Is it's primarily a tech product that happens to drive you around. So at the high end, it should be a lot easier to transition than some of the really large portfolios that we see for mainstream.
Right, talking about the big brands, you drive a Jeep Wrangler, and we know about that because you tweeted about that. But if we look at some of the other big companies in the United States, if we look at Jeep, well, I've just talked about Jeep, Humvee, Mustang, they're all going electric. These are traditional brands, they're well-known brands. What do you make of this pivot that they're making?
Well, it certainly makes sense. Again, they're trying to hit the broad part of the market. I do drive the Jeep 4xe, the plug-in version hybrid Wrangler, and that takes the fuel economy from a fairly low level to something that is about 50 mpge in the United States. So it becomes much more competitive fuel economy-wise. But where you get Ford and Chevy really putting their toe in the market, or in some cases now jumping in, because now they're starting to convert the pickup trucks. And that is sort of the tipping point, I think, in the United States. The EV Silverado, the F-150 Lightning, if we start getting pickup truck consumers converted over to EVs, that's really where I think we start to see the U.S. take off.
Lee, if we look at Tesla, I mean, that's the market leader right now. It has a presence in China. In fact, Tesla has a factory in China right now as well. But we don't see it the other way around. I mean, do you see Chinese companies building plants here in the United States?
I do. So BYD, we were just talking about them earlier, they're going to be presenting at CES 2023. They've already made announcements about entering Japan, Thailand, Netherlands, a bunch of other, Singapore, Australia recently. So they're going to be very, very aggressive starting in 2023 on the passenger vehicle side. We already know that they sell commercial buses, the electric buses in the United States and in other countries, but they're going to take a lead. NIO has already announced that by 2025, they're going to be in 25 countries, including the United States. And so I would guess there's going to be at least a handful of Chinese EV companies that will enter the market by 2025. The irony of it is it's a Vietnamese company that's VinFast is going to beat them to the market in the U.S. By building a factory in North Carolina. But I think longer term, they will be building in North America, whether that's the United States, Mexico, or Canada. I'm still not sure yet, but if you want to become a market leader, you can't export or import your way into that position in the United States. And so eventually they will end up manufacturing locally.
So when you say, Lee, that they're going to be very, very aggressive, I mean, what are they going to bring to the U.S. market that's going to make them competitive?
Well, I think Tyson had mentioned it earlier. What's really missing is the sweet spot, the mass market electric vehicle that's affordable to many if not most. And the Bolt is one vehicle at a $28,000 or $26,000 price point. But I think what you'll find is it's not very fully featured. And if you come to look at the products in China across the board in the mass market segment, we're talking about under 300,000 RMB, which is about $45,000. You'll see that it's very fully featured, long extended range, big batteries, a lot of connectivity. And so what we'll start to see is that kind of stuff, those features trickle over to Europe and the United States, because there's already 12 or 14 brands, Chinese brands, that are entering Europe this year. And so that'll become more of an extension of what's going on, and it's going to create more competition among the domestic players, whether they're German, French, or American. And I think that's what the United States also needs to really kickstart this demand, because what we're seeing here is multiple products at every price segment that creates competition and a lot of innovation. So,
Tyson, getting to that sweet spot in the United States, the U.S. Congress seems to be on board, because they're expected to pass legislation, which probably will be passed in the next week or so, that will make electric vehicles cheaper. That drop in price will come in the form of tax credits that the government will be offering. Of course, there are some caveats. There's going to be a certain amount of minimum content, domestic content, that is, in those vehicles. It's got to be assembled here in the United States. But even with those caveats, will that have a big impact here?
Well, it should have a big impact, and we're, as the industry analysts, still trying to sort through the details of this bill. As you said, there are a lot of caveats within. But what it does is it restores the tax incentive for Tesla and General Motors, who had already crossed over the U.S.'s line where they had capped out of credits. So vehicles like the Bolt, like the Model 3 and the Model Y from Tesla, will now be up to $7,500 cheaper than they were. However, for most vehicles in the market, there will be no change in theory. Every other caveat consistent. However, if you don't produce and don't source in the U.S., which is a lot of European and Asian brands currently that have EVs in the U.S., they won't be entitled to any tax credit. So while this is looking better for a lot of consumers and a lot of brands, there's a lot of vehicles right now that are going to have to shift their sourcing very quickly if they want to remain in the U.S. As Thule mentioned earlier, VinFast is building here. That's not just a nice to have or something competitive. It's going to be a requirement, because the Inflation Reduction Act does specifically target the supply chain to move most of that onshore to the U.S.
And very quickly, Tyson, I've only got about 30 seconds left. There was an analysis done by a Bank of America analyst recently, which wrote that he said that Tesla's dominance in the market is coming to an end with many more models coming to the market. That analyst says Tesla's market share, which is currently 70%, or 70% last year, will drop to 11% by 2025. What do you make of that?
That's a little drastic of a drop, but if I'm Tesla, I know that an expanding EV market is going to lift my volume. So I'm probably not going to hold on to my share, but the number of vehicles I sell will go up significantly, even as there are more competitors in the market. And if I'm Elon Musk, I'm okay with that.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Now we are going to discuss the environmental issue. Are electric vehicles better for nature? To talk about that, we welcome Marc Morano. He is Executive Director and Chief Correspondent of ClimateDepot.com. He joins us right here in Washington, D.C. And across the river from Arlington, Virginia, Changhua is the CEO of the Beijing Future Innovation Center. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Marc, let me start with you. There was a survey done recently by AAA which showed that 1 in 4 Americans say that they want to drive an electric car. They want to get behind the wheel of an electric car, leave their gas-driven car behind. Are we seeing the final days of the petrol and diesel-driven vehicle in the United States?
No, I don't think so. I think that the big issue here isn't that like a new car is being offered and consumers have a choice and they're going to go over and vote to go electric. Unfortunately, that's not happening with government mandates and even what the World Bank is up to. Nicholas Stern just announced the end of conventional engine sales, oil gas-based engine, should stop. So when you have the bankers behind the scenes essentially saying this is going to stop, and you have all the governments mandating higher and higher fuel economy, putting the end, I think as California has done, a couple other places and around the world, the end of the sale and even the production of gas-powered cars. This is a forced, mandated, controlled, planned move against the wishes of average consumers. So when you cite a survey like that, yeah, it sounds interesting. People hear a Tesla, they might sit in one, they have all the latest gadgetry, they're very fast. I, for one, wouldn't drive an electric car because I like stick shift, and all my cars have been stick shift. Until they invent a way for me to have at least a simulated, authentic stick shift, I wouldn't get it. But essentially, I'm arguing against this whole idea of the mandated electric cars. I think it should be a consumer choice. You cannot force the end, an unnatural end to gas-powered cars. And unfortunately, due to this alleged climate crisis, that's exactly where every government's policies are headed. We need to call a timeout and say, stop this madness.
Well, there is the environmental issue, Mark, isn't there?
There is. And when you consider, first of all, national security, here in the United States, the more we go with solar, wind, and even electric cars, particularly electric cars, the more reliance we'll have on China, the more reliance we're going to have on rare earth mining, which we alone are not allowed to do. I interviewed a lanthanide mine that got shut in the Mojave Desert here in California in the United States. At the same time, China was able to open up their mines, and they don't have as strict of environmental standards. They don't have the politics. They're building a coal plant a week by some estimates. So they're going full steam ahead. The problem comes when we're giving up a gas-powered car with the illusion that the electric car is somehow going to be more environmentally friendly. Yeah. Electric cars dig the earth. And that's the bottom line. And also you have battery, you have recycling, you have also the cost benefit. Is it actually going to, if you buy an expensive electric car, will you save money in the long run versus a cheaper gas-powered car?
All right.
Very good question.
All right, Changhua, well, what do you make of these concerns that have been expressed by Mark? Because, the United States doesn't want to be too dependent on China for things like rare earth elements.
Totally ridiculous, and that's a zero-sum mentality mindset, which is unfortunately slowing down the global decarbonization process, because we all agreed or accept the reality climate change is the biggest existential threat to the humanity, and at this moment, more than ever, we need to accelerate the transition. Particular mobility is major emission sources actually to address that situation. Compared to the US, China definitely has been way ahead, and the society has no problem of embracing the electrification of mobility. And by June this year, China already has a total of 10 million electric vehicles fleet actually on the street, and the pace is further accelerating. But I do want to echo one point Mark raised. So we are constrained. We are going to continue to be constrained in terms of critical metals, actually resources there. And that's another issue global community needs to figure out how to address, because no matter what, we make cars, vehicles, we need materials. We have to continue to mine from nature. Somehow we do need to figure out how to minimize the negative impact as much as possible. But in the meantime, more than ever, US, China, EU need to work together in order to improve the efficiency and productivity, and particularly actually saving the resources or reduce the resource consumption at this critical moment.
Right. Changhua, electric vehicles are here, and there are efforts being made to increase sales to people. I mean, at what stage do you think we will get to a tipping point where the use of electric vehicles will have a significant impact on the environment?
Well, currently, if you look at China, US, EU, particular major economies, we all set sort of a plan, strategic plan. If you look at China, China has made the plan clearly on paper. At this moment, by 2025, we want to have new sales of vehicles. Actually, 20% of them shall be electric vehicle. By 2035, that needs to be, 50%. So I think around 2030, 2035, global community, particularly from major economies, that's going to be a very important tipping point where mobility is expected to be more geared towards electrification rather than internal combustion engine.
Mark, at the moment, there are long delays in getting electrical vehicles, or in fact, any vehicle in the United States. Yeah. There are delivery problems. And of course, when it comes to electric vehicles, there are also these hefty price tags attached. But if we look at some of the major companies, like I was discussing with our two earlier guests, companies like Ford, like Humvee, like Jaguar, for instance, I mean, they're talking about a major shift from petrol-driven vehicles to electric vehicles.
And I would argue, yes, they are. But I would argue that's not coming from consumer demand necessarily. That's coming from reading the tea leaves of government regulators, reading the tea leaves of the banking industry. Mm-hmm. So what's happening here is Americans aren't given a choice. And with all due respect, we do not look at it as a zero-sum game with China. I mean, we look at it as dangerous to have reliance on China. There's concern over China buying up U.S. farmland. There's concern about our reliance on China for all these critical rare earth metals and mining. And this is something that Americans don't want to do. The other thing is the Biden administration's strategic mistake of making this national electrification car charging grid. Now, what's scary about that, and again, we're dealing with 2022 now. This is not 2019. We lived through COVID. So at least half or 40% of the U.S. population is suspicious of an electric car technology that's going to be centrally planned, first of all, decades in advance, number one. And number two, the charging stations run by the federal government that can be shut down. If a government decides we need another viral lockdown like COVID, they can turn off a charging grid. This is not the America people are willing to accept. And believe me, that is a big issue. You may chuckle, you may laugh when someone like me says that. But after we've lived through lockdowns and this kind of government control, we don't want to turn to a technology like electric cars that are going to record every aspect of our life, lane avoidance, driverless cars. And I think there's going to be a healthy dose of significant skepticism, and that's going to trickle into the politics. And my hope is these mandates for electric cars start getting rolled back. Beginning with the midterm elections, it's going to be a repudiation of Joe Biden's electric car politics.
Well, that's not what's happening, because we look at the Inflation Reduction Act. There's money in there to expand these grids, as well as provide credits for people who want to buy these cars. Well, I want to get to Changhua Wu. Changhua Wu, what do you make of those fears that Mark expressed there?
Again, I don't want to be stuck in this sort of, U.S. incrimination of China continuously. This doesn't really going anywhere at this moment. Just to give you a perspective, for a long history, when China opened the market actually to automakers from the U.S. and other countries, which is internal combustion engine vehicles burning fossil fuels, somehow at that moment, no one was saying, okay, China shouldn't rely on the U.S. actually on this heavy polluting technology solutions for mobility. But now, from the U.S. side, you are incriminating China and blaming China, pointing finger to China in terms of resource mining, using some environmental pollution issues, whatever. That's totally unfair. It's demonizing China. I think that's the point we need to end as soon as possible. If we really are serious about tackling global climate change issues, which we all on paper, in public speeches by politician leaders, basically saying this is the most critical, existential threat to human society, somehow then we do need to figure out how to put aside the zero-sum game mentality and trying to figure out to work with each other.
Changhua, just on that point of combating climate change, how effective are electric vehicles in combating climate change? Because they use electricity. That electricity has to come from somewhere. It normally comes from power plants driven by coal.
Yes. There is no pure sort of a cleanest sort of way of doing that. There are always trade-offs. But all the studies, more and more studies are coming out pointing to the reality, even though today we probably still have to rely on coal-powered facility, electricity, still, generally speaking, midterm, longer term, they are going to be cleaner compared to internal combustion engine. That's the reality.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Time's caught up with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.